Today we're going to head out into the perennial beds. A few weeks ago we did a video on trimming perennials, and I got so many questions on how to trim perennials that I decided I'd go out in the garden and trim a few more. Hi, I'm Heidi from Garden Crossings, and today I think we're going to hit on about 12 to 14 or so perennials out in the gardens, and I'm going to show you how to trim them now that it's fall, maybe talk a little bit about the plants, and just show you what exactly it is that you need to do now that it's fall and time for garden cleanup. So let's go head out into the gardens. In the last video, one of our viewers asked if it was okay to trim a freshly or newly planted hosta in the fall. So the answer is, how newly planted is it? So I would recommend planting your hosta and letting it get established for a good 4 weeks or so before you would do any fall trimming on it. You want to give it a little bit of time to let those roots get established into the ground. It's also good to trim those hostas before that first hard frost of the season. So here we have a newly or young planted hosta. This is the Hasta Voices in the Wind, and you can see it's not very big. It was planted earlier this summer, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to grab it because it's easy, because it's small, and I'm going to snip these leaves back. So interestingly enough, we have had some frost here in West Michigan, and because this hosta is under this huge tree, it's created a microclimate, and this tree has given it protection from that first hard frost. And we had a really hard frost about a week or so ago. But because this created a microclimate, you can see there's a couple other hostas underneath here that too have just as fresh of leaves as this Voices in the Wind did. So I like to get the hostas trimmed before they get mushy and gross, and this one has had enough time for it to get its roots established so that it is okay to get it trimmed this fall. Leucanthemum or Shasta daisies, how to trim those back. So here we have Daisy May, and she is blooming so beautifully right now. It is just about November 1st here in West Michigan, and this really is not typical of daisies for this late in the season. So I'm going to go ahead and just show you how we would trim back these daisies. So we're going to go in, and I'm just going to grab the daisies in my hand, the actual flowers, and you can see there's a lot of dense, thick foliage under there. So you could just go in and trim it like so, removing any of these spent blooms. So trimming it back and leaving that foliage there. Now that foliage is going to turn brown during the winter, so we could actually go in and even trim it just a little bit further. This is going to make such a nice bouquet. Too bad I don't have a vase out here. We'll go in the compost. All right, so I'm going to take another handful and just go in here a little bit deeper. And this is where a scissors would be much better for doing this job. Something with a longer cutting edge. All right, so you can see how I took most of that foliage off, trimming it down to about 4 inches or so. So I'm just going to go in here and grab another handful and continue to trim. There we go. So there's another plant back here. Get that one trimmed as well. So it's leaving just a little bit of this foliage behind, but getting rid of most of the tops. That way next spring when the new flowers emerge, nothing is going to emerge from anything you're seeing green right here now. All of the new growth is going to come from the ground, in the ground. So it's going to cover up anything we're seeing here that I have left behind. So that's about how far I would trim back daisies in the fall. Or if you don't get to them until the spring, that's how far I trim them back in the spring. So Monarda plants really are a very easy plant to trim in the fall. And the best tool I would recommend for doing this is a hedge trimmer, because this is one where you can just take that hedge trimmer and run it right along the ground and just snip off all the tops. That would make the job go a lot quicker. I don't have a hedge trimmer out here, so I'm going to be doing it with a pruner. I am going to leave most of it for the gardeners to do with the hedge trimmer because they can go a lot quicker doing it that way. But I do want to show you how low I am going to have them trim it back. So we're going to go in, and basically I'm just going to take a handful of the foliage, the stems, and I'm going to trim this down like as close to the ground as I can. That is the nice thing with perennials, is that all of their, next year's growth, it all comes from the ground. So anything I'm trimming off here is nothing that's needed for next year's plant or for next year's flowers. So you can see I have it trimmed really nice and tight there to the ground. You can see there's a lot of milkweed seed kind of caught in these old branches here. But we're going to go in, and with that hedge trimmer, when the gardeners get over here, they're just going to go ahead and run it right along the ground and cut off all of the old tops of this Monarda, also known as bee balm. Another question we got from one of our viewers is, when is the best time to trim the Virginia, also known as pig squeak? So this here is actually the Miss Piggy variety, and this plant is best trimmed in the spring. So what you would do after the winter has occurred, this plant can be semi-evergreen in a lot of areas. So after the winter, if there's any like damaged or tattered leaves, you could go ahead and get them removed. So you can see these leaves are all pretty fresh looking. But like down in here, you can see these are kind of crunchy and spent blooms. Those could get removed in the spring. Anything that's just not looking fresh and clean, that could be removed in the spring. Also, it's recommended that once this plant is done flowering, that you go ahead and trim back any of the spent blooms. So realistically, we should have come in this summer and trimmed back any of these dead or old spent blooms. I'm doing it now. But best plant care for this would be to do your trimming in the spring after the winter is finished. Another question that you had was when and how to trim lavender. So that's more of a tricky question because it really depends on what are your goals for the lavender plant. This lavender here is the Sweet Romance lavender. So in this early spring, you can prune to remove any winter damage and to shape the plant. Wait until the new leaves appear, but before the buds start to emerge. Now in late spring, you may want to prune it after a big flush of blooms, or in our case in early summer, after a big flush of blooms, and that will encourage hopefully a second round of blooms for you to enjoy a little bit later in the summer. Now in the late summer, you could prune it again after the flowers fade, and you would do that to kind of control the growth of the plant and just to neaten it up a little bit. In the fall, a light trim after the flowers fade can remove branches that may break in the snow and ice. So if you see any branches that look like they're weak and or may not make it through the winter, those would be the ones I would recommend trimming in the late fall. But in general, the rule of thumb is it's best not to prune in the fall at all, especially in the northern climates like what we are here in Michigan, as this sometimes can be detrimental to the plant and potentially kill it. Proscia or Russian sage, that's another one of those kind of controversial perennials as to when is the perfect time to trim it. A lot of people are going to tell you that in the spring is the best time to trim it, and that's great. But for us, again, fall is our time to trim, and I've had really good luck with trimming it in the fall. So let's take a look at how far I'm going to trim this Russian sage down. So right now this is the denim and lace Russian sage. It's about 18 or so inches tall. Some of the benefits, I guess, if you wanted to keep it through the winter, is because you can kind of enjoy some of that silvery foliage look in the garden. For us here in Michigan, it's going to get covered with snow and it's just not going to look good. So I'm going to go ahead and take it, and this one I'm not going to trim all the way down to the ground. I'm going to trim it maybe about 4 inches or so. And it's funny because of the warm fall, I'm starting to see some new growth right down there at the base of the ground here. That will go dormant once it gets hit, you know, by the cool weather. But yeah, right in here, tucked in the center, this is all new growth that's emerging because it's very confused. So there we go. We've got it at about 4 inches tall right now, and that will be happy as it's growing through the winter. It's best to wait until the first frost to trim your ligularia. Here we have the ligularia bottle rocket, and you can see a lot of the leaves are starting to get brown and crunchy. That's because they have been hit by the frost. So I'm going to go ahead and just take the plant in my hand, and I'm going to trim it back to about 3 inches or so. So that's ready for the winter. Here's another one. I'll go ahead and just grab that in my hand and trim it too back by about 3 inches. A lot of times when you're trimming your perennials, you can kind of look to the insides of them and you'll see some of your last year's growth. And sometimes that's kind of a nice guide as to where you trimmed them last year and where you could trim them again this year. So looking in here, I can see there's some really woody old stems, and that's where this plant was trimmed last year. Down in here, another one where it was trimmed last year. So sometimes it's just, you know, use your guides from one year to the next where all your old dead branches are. Here's a mass planting of the alium serendipity, and you can see the spent flowers. They look kind of cool even later on here in the season. So sometimes it's kind of fun to leave these. But now that it's, you know, late summer, it's time for these things to get trimmed. Here's a giant grass weed. Pull that out. I'm just going to take my hand around the flower stalks and I'm going to trim it about, I don't know, it's about 3 or so inches off the ground. I could go closer if I wanted to. This is one that would be better done with a hedge trimmers or a scissors or something with a longer blade than what I have here on my pruners. One nice thing with this is it does clean up pretty easy because you can get everything in your hand and just hold it and have a nice easy removal. Another viewer had questioned when to trim sedum. So the gardeners did go through this bed earlier today and kind of selectively trim some things out. This here is the Sedum Bright Idea, and they just took their trimmers and trimmed it down to about 2 inches or so. That's kind of some of the dead that's remaining, and that will be nice and tidy and ready for the winter. Now again, with the sedum, you can see it is trying to push out some growth right down in there. That's all new growth it's trying to push out because of the warm fall again. But once we get cold, this will all fall asleep. When this sedum comes back next spring, you will not see anything come back off of any of this old wood that I'm kind of pulling out here. Any new growth is going to come back in from the base of the plant in the ground here, like you're seeing happen right now, right there. So all of this is just has no use next year. This is all dead and not really a vital part of the plant at this point. So one of you had asked, when is the best time to trim Agastache or hyssop? Well, you can see this hyssop now is definitely done for the season. This is one of the longest blooming perennials in this garden bed. And so we're going to go ahead and we're going to trim this back to the base. Now, I should say this plant can be kind of a tender perennial in some areas. So if you're at the lower end of its hardiness zone, you may not want to trim quite as much off as I am. I'm in a zone 6A. We trim everything back as if it were, you know, any other plant. So I'm not careful about my trimming, and you can see they come back beautifully every year. But for those of you that are in the lower spectrum, maybe a zone 5, maybe don't trim quite as much off. So what does that mean? All right, so if you're a zone 5, maybe in a little bit more of a tender area, trim it back to 6 or 8 inches or so. Leaves a little bit of protection on the plant. And interestingly enough, you can see this plant too is putting on new growth way there at the base by the ground. That is where your new growth is going to come from next season, and that will get nipped by the frost and, you know, obviously go dormant here in the winter. I'm going to go ahead and take another handful here, and I am going to trim just above where we're seeing that new growth, like so. So that is kind of getting rid of some of that protection that would remain if we left some of this foliage here for the winter. But I want to get this nicely tidied up so I don't have to deal with it again next spring. I've said it before and I'll say it again, I break the rules when it comes to trimming because I have the approach of, you know, making gardening fun and not as hard and not as picky as what some people make it out to be. I like to do it when I have time, when it's convenient for me. There we go. So that is how I trim my Agastache for the winter. Another question I got asked is, when do you trim Dianthus? That one's a little hard as well, because Dianthus, if you really go in and trim it, it's going to look woody, and a lot of times it just does not come back nice. So we have 2 examples of Dianthus right here, and I want to show you what our gardeners have done. This here is the Fruit Punch series of Dianthus, and it's a little bit taller, a little bit more mounded. The gardeners, when they came through, they just lightly trimmed, and mostly what they did is they just trimmed off the flowers off this plant. So here's one, for example, where there's just a few of the blooms remaining. So they would just go in and kind of just nip off these flowers, not taking a lot off of the foliage that's here. Because if you get down in here, this is what you're going to have, is you're going to have a lot of woody. And a lot of times that woody, especially for us here, does not come back and does not look good. As we move down just a little bit further, we have another type of Dianthus, and this is the Dianthus Paint the Town series. You can see this one is a lot lower growing to the ground. That's just the habit of this particular one. And this one too, they don't do a lot of trimming on it. They'll just take their scissors and they'll trim any little flowers that remain. So these flowers are pretty short in the plant. Typically I'm going to kind of pull this up a little bit. Typically these flowers are probably about 4 or so inches above this foliage. So what they'll do is they'll come through and they'll just kind of nip off any of the flowers that are sitting above the foliage. The trimming really does not get into the foliage part of the plant, because again, if you get into the foliage part of the plant, we're going to kind of look there, you can see how that's all very woody. And a lot of times if you get cutting into this woodiness, the plant just does not come back nicely. So it's best just to kind of take your scissors and just trim any flowers that are sitting just nicely on top of the foliage. Here's the Heaven Sent Jacob's Ladder, and the best time to trim this back is in the fall after your first hard frost. So this can be trimmed back to the ground. We're just going to get in there and start snipping and pruning away. This would be nice if I had like a scissors, or again, this would be another plant that you could use a hedge trimmer on. The stalks are kind of mushy, so it's not cutting through there super great. One thing you'll notice about me is I am not a glove wearer. I do not like to wear garden gloves. I feel like they get in the way. Are you someone that wears gloves, or do you feel like they get in the way too? Now, I don't like slimy plants. That's really gross to me. That's why we like to get this done ahead of the slime time. But just getting in there and getting this all trimmed back. There we go. That was a lot of foliage on that plant. Goodness gracious. There we go. And that is how we trim back the Jacob's Ladder. Thank you for walking through the gardens with me today. If you have any questions on any additional perennials and how to get them cleaned up for fall, please feel free to leave it in the comments below. And if you're new to our channel, we welcome you to subscribe. Thanks for watching. I'm Heidi from Garden Crossings.